Okay, perfect. So I want to thank you all for joining me this afternoon, and I want to introduce our presenter today, Lee James. Lee has come in with so much energy and knowledge already about the Pratt family, and so I'm excited to hear what he has to say and learn a little bit more about him and his life on the prairie as well. So take it away, Lee.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jordan. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. We're very glad that we can be here today. It's been an interesting scramble with snow down at the south end and losing our internet connection. And Patrick Hussey is with me today at the same table. Originally, I was going to use his internet connection because it was better than ours. And we both lost internet. So now we're at my prairie house. This is on Eby's Prairie. We're broadcasting to you, overlooking Eby's Landing, and we can actually see the trees and the Pratt property up on the hill. So just a little bit about the setting, and Patrick's going to back me up a little bit in my hearing at times, and we'll have a good time putting this together, I think. Well, here we are on President's Day, and happy President's Day. I don't know how much of a holiday it is for you, but for me, it brings to mind a couple of Pratt-related things, interestingly enough. The first one happened in 1885, and that's when Frank Pratt Jr.'s father, the senior, was appointed by the president to be the internal revenue collector for the part of Massachusetts where they lived. Okay, that's the first item related to the Pratt family and presidents. The second one has more to do with Frank's second wife and her sister from St. Louis. They somehow wound up on the hotel registry on the same page, indicating that probably Helen Tower Pratt was there at the same time that Teddy Roosevelt was at the Hotel de Haro at today's Roche Harbor on San Juan Island.
Really?
Yeah, so if you go there today and you look at the old register that they have on display there, her name is just several lines away from Teddy Roosevelt's.
Wow.
So interesting. So a little bit of Pratt lore and trivia. Today in this presentation, what I plan to do is I plan to, first of all, indicate why the Pratt family is important to us. What's the significance? Secondly, I want to touch on the heritage that he brought with him from Massachusetts. He was already a heritage guy. And then he wound up here just kind of looking around, maybe looking for land. And he was really taken by it. And I have a hunch he felt at home, the old structures that he was so accustomed to back in Massachusetts showed up here. And so he ended up buying land here. And so we're talking heritage pretty heavily today. And then the third thing I want to accomplish is for you, the docents of the Jacob Eby house, what around it pertains to the Pratts. And we'll go kind of structure by structure and just almost like a walking tour, so that you'll know what's many, you really probably know a lot of that part already, but I'll just do a little bit of a review for you. And so that's what we have in mind. I want to mention my information sources because that's something that you can plug into. The fact is I just kind of got going on this Pratt lore maybe ahead of some other people in the community several years ago. And one of the things that prompted it was the availability of a lot of digitized files that a gentleman by the name of Ron Hansen helped facilitate, and a couple of local residents here contributed to that effort. The result was that today at the Island County Museum, you can go in there and talk to Indy, the archivist, and just say, I want to download the treasure trove having to do with the Pratt family, and she can help you do that on a thumbnail or something. Anyway, that's what I did, and with Ron Hansen. And so I just got into it. You know, I really enjoyed it, and made a number of presentations within about a 2-year period after that. I want to mention which people we're going to be talking about today, the players of our presentation and discussion, just in passing, so that you can start to get familiar with some of the names. Obviously, there's on the Pratt side, Frank Josiah Pratt Jr. He's the main person I'll be talking about. There's his third wife, Lena, who is from Cooteville. And then there was Robert, who's the son, and a little bit about him, not a lot in this presentation. And then on the EB side, there's Mary E.B. Boatsart, and then her daughter is Elmira Enos. Okay, and that's a name you may have come across, but she's not very well known. However, she plays into Frank Pratt's activities around here buying land. And then Elmira's daughter, Edith Park. And that's probably definitely a name you haven't heard of, but she was a pretty cool person, and we'll touch on her. Then, of course, we have Jacob and Sarah Eby, the parents of Isaac and Mary. I'd like to, at this point, share a lantern slide with you. And what this is Frank Pratt Jr. He's in his study. Let's see if I can see how that's coming through.
Looks good, Lee.
There we go. Yep, looking good. Okay, yeah, this is really a good photo to look at about him, because he was a kind of a studious kind of guy. He really enjoyed learning about all sorts of things. His library reflects that. And so this is a kind of a quiet moment where he's just in his element. And then his third wife, we'll talk mostly about, is Lena Pratt, and that's Lena. Okay. Okay, I think what we can do is almost like a walking tour up there on the hilltop where Frank lived. And we'll start with the Jacob Eby cabin, since that's where you'll hang your hat and doing the volunteer work and everything. And that's part of things up there that I think you're probably already pretty familiar with. It was a little bit later of an acquisition for Frank. Frank bought up a number of properties around, and he had to kind of work on this Jacob Eby acquisition. With that, he was in touch with Elmira Enos, who was down in California, like so many of the later Ebys were. And it was over at least a couple of year period where he was in negotiations with Elmira to acquire the cabin. And finally, they consented to sell it. And he really kind of kept the cabin, as far as I know, pretty much the way it was. You may know of some other lore about it, like maybe where the kitchen was located, if it was off the back, which I think it might have been. But it's really an example of what Frank typically did with these historic structures, and that was to simply preserve them and really not change them very much. The blockhouse there is another story. And that one he actually reconstructed. Going the wrong way. I'm sorry, I was doing my toggle on the computer wrong. So that one was in pretty bad shape when Frank acquired it and needed a lot of work. So they reconstructed it. And as a part of that total effort, Frank was working, I think, with the Works Progress Administration and an architect from that organization that drew up some really nice drawings of it, real professional looking and all. Maybe you've seen those. They're available today. Let me back up just a second to the cabin and its acquisition. This is kind of a real seminal kind of quote here from a letter that Frank wrote to Elmira about having discovered this location and the land and everything, his interest in it. He said, Mrs. Pratt and I, in a visit to the island, were very much captivated with the view of landscape and sea from Eby's Prairie. That is all. We know nothing about ranches as such, or soil, or other conditions of importance to farmers. Our interest is chiefly a sentimental one for beautiful natural conditions. That says a lot about Frank and his wife at the time, Helen Tower, the second wife, what brought them here and why they probably ended up staying. It was just beautiful and historic. So now I'd like to go down the trail. Maybe we can kind of start our walking tour, in this case, from the parking lot. As you, I think, already know, the bungalow residence that Frank and Helen and Lena built is on the left and just really right off the trail, not too far. And something that people may or may not take an interest in when they walk by, but it's obviously important. And that house is a lot like it was way back when. But it's actually been reconstructed also, like the blockhouse. There was just a small part of it that survived, and I'll go into it a little bit later. But it's very much like it was to begin with. And then on that same property, which is about 5 acres, there are other structures. And a number of them, most of them really can be seen from the trail. So might come up in a discussion sometime to a visitor, that on that same 5-acre parcel, if you walk down a little bit farther away from the bungalow towards the cabin, you have the cook's quarters. That's the first one you come across. The second one is the playhouse. And the third one is a shop, a larger shop building, which is very close to the trail. And those are all pretty much like they were before, a little bit restored in some cases. And then if I could go kind of the other direction from the bungalow residence, there's right close to it, the longhouse. And that house wasn't there at the very beginning, but it was later added. And it served as a kind of residence for people. It was fully equipped. It had heating, a kitchen. And today it's not so much a bunkhouse type thing, but more of a just kind of things the way they were, and it's the shelves in there lined with the original books that have always been there. So it's kind of interesting. I'm going to show you now the progression of things, that the way the house, the bungalow residence was constructed. The first one here shows the second stage of construction. The second part of it is actually the portion that's closest to us in the picture. And then kind of behind it in an L-shaped fashion is the original part. So the original was a simple cabin, even though Frank Pratt had all kinds of money and resources and all, they kept it simple on purpose. And that's part of why Frank's important to us today, is because he used local materials and he wanted it to blend in to the countryside. So it's actually situated up on this kind of like a hilltop bench in a way that's not obtrusive. It's not overly noticeable. And then later on, he added to that a third section. And here you can see that the third section is quite a bit like the first one. And the total arrangement of the house is essentially in the shape of an H, the letter H. And all of it, going together well. The interior was also kind of seamless. And so if you go inside, the passageway continues through that complex of three structures joined together. And they're also kind of tied together by the way it's furnished. There are a lot of bookshelves in the house. And this shows the example of one. And that was just fairly typical in it throughout. And there's also art placed on the top of the bookshelves, typically 1 to 3 oil paintings deep. So Frank obviously had an interest in art and learning and so on. And that was reflected in a letter that an EB descendant by the name of Edith Park wrote to him in 1929. And I'll read that to you. She says, "Live long on your hilltop to enjoy the wonderful view out your window. And also your treasures within, in other words, enjoy them, for you have the soul of an artist." She closes with kindest regards to yourself and Mrs. Pratt and Robert. Sincerely, Edith Park. So there's an EB descendant living in California who evidently got to know the Pratt family rather well and thought very highly of them. And, originally there was some controversy over whether to sell them land, but now I think we have a pretty strong endorsement here for that. Well, where were Frank's sensibilities cultivated? How, more or less, how was he the way he was? He grew up in Greenfield, Massachusetts. Sorry, okay. This is a heritage community that got going in the 1700s. And I characterize it typically as kind of a Courier and Ives type community. There's just all the covered bridges and sleighs, railroad pulling through, brick buildings, lots of Yankee workshop kind of stuff. And his family was pretty prominent. They lived right in the heart of Greenfield. And Greenfield itself was situated on 3 rivers. It was on a plain. His family was into this kind of stuff. Anyway, he a lot of the way he became was a result of this. I think when he arrived at Eby's Landing and all, I think he just felt really at home. And really the residence we've been talking about up on what he called Hilltop was to begin with his summer residence. And then over time, he found himself spending more and more time here rather than the Redlands, California, where his winter residence was. And, you know, they thought maybe at first that they would retire there, but they had actually ended up here. And he had his boat Suva up here too. He heavily got into boating up here, several boats, big ones. And Suva is the one that you probably know of that's local here, that's the schooner and is active today off of Coopville Wharf.
Lee.
Excuse me, can we ask questions?
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Sandy.
Yeah, Sandy.
So the Suva, did he sail it here from California?
Okay. Yeah, Suva was exclusively up here. The story on that is that Suva was built in Hong Kong and transported from Hong Kong to Victoria, British Columbia for fitting. That means stepping the masts, doing the rigging, maybe installing the engine too. I'm not sure about that part. But anyway, once Suva got situated in Victoria, then Suva sailed to Coopville. And that's how she got here. Yeah.
So they kept it in Penn Cove.
They kept it in Penn Cove.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, it was Suva was anchored most of the time at Good Beach, if you know where that is. That's where a lot of the mussel operations are conducted. Yeah, and there are boats there today. And then, yeah, so mostly that's where Suva was, never in California as far as I know.
But did they sail it around the San Juan Islands, or?
Yeah.
I'm not hearing anything that sounds like they actually used it.
Yeah, so they used it a lot, but it's mostly seasonal, like every summer. And Frank had quite an interest in British history and culture and government and so on. So I think he liked British Columbia quite a bit. And so a lot of times he went up to Princess Louisa Inlet. And he sailed other boats that he had up there too. We have some records of that. He was actually a pretty active boater. Yeah, thank you. Okay, any other questions while we're taking a pause here from what I'm relating? Okay. You know, Hilltop was up on a hill. Obviously, it was away from town. He was, to some people, known a little bit because they worked for him, but I get the feeling that he didn't really integrate with the community all that much. So there was the family living up there in the hill, out of town, and as far as we can tell, he was a bit of a mystery for people and a little bit controversial and just a big question mark. So it turns out that he was, under the right conditions, pretty accessible. And the right conditions for him had to do with his interest. You know, he liked to sail, he liked art, he liked reading books, even know new famous authors. So if somebody happened to link up with him And it was a little obvious that they shared his interest. I think he could latch on to them pretty readily. So that was the currency, the interpersonal currency for him was common interest. And so that just hopefully gives you a little bit of insight as to what kind of person he was, because some people, some locals did feel like he was really quite a bit separated. If you're on the hilltop and you look down in the prairie below and everything, you see some other properties of his. There's the ferry house he owned, also was acquired separately from an Eby family member in California once again. And so he owned some land there and the house, and there used to be a kind of a barn there too. And then he didn't do a lot to that house, other than maintain it. Once again, that was his style. And then sweeping across the prairie to kind of way in the back on the left from the view in his house is the Jenny farm, which he owned too, but that might have had quite a bit to do with Lena. Lena was part of the Jenny family. They were related. But there they had somebody take care of the house more actively. Robert largely saw to that later on. And they had somebody live in the house, a couple who I actually met, who were caretakers for the house. So that house stayed in pretty good condition. Also, in view or in the area of the bungalow house that was the main residence, were two commemorative markers. And these are nice granite style markers that Frank put together in collaboration with the really well-known Washington State historian, Edmund Meany. The first one I'll mention was really close to the residence, and that's the one that commemorates Sunnyside and the Jacob Eby family and their settlement up there. They're having trekked across on the trail, and a little bit of background on Jacob. Very nice. And then the second monument is overlooking Eby's Landing, and that one commemorates Isaac Eby and his family, and also mentions the beheading. And the cabins where Isaac lived. Mm-hmm.
That's fascinating, Lee. I didn't realize that he worked with Professor Meany on those monuments.
Yeah, there's a recent development in our lore on the Pratts, which I've been looking to do, and I got some help on it. A friend went to the library there at the University of Washington to pull out the box of materials that had to do with the back and forth between Edmund Meany and Frank Pratt. There's a whole box on it. And in that box, discovered that Edmund Meany not only was interested in just the historical things around here, but he really liked coming here. and he came here on special occasions a number of times. And then annually they had a picnic at Hilltop, Frank Pratt's property. They pulled in their automobiles, put, style, and set up a picnic right there on Hilltop. And this was standard operating procedure for Edmund Meany. Pretty cool.
So Robert or Frank and Professor Meany were out on the porch smoking cigars.
Undoubtedly. Yeah, little home brew.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, and they had a picnic too out on the grounds.
Nice.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful stuff. Okay. Well, summing up, which I need to do because I want to open things up to more discussion. So, Frank really, by virtue of his upbringing and his personal sensibilities, brought to and cultivated a lot of the kind of thinking and ideas that we have about today's Eby's Landing Reserve. So, I think we can say that he was, in effect, kind of a founder for it. He was a spiritual founder, kind of like Jimmy Jean Cook was. And so I'd like to list the two of them as being very instrumental in formation of the reserve. And I've gotten some confirmation that from reserve officials that they kind of see it the same way. And that, maybe more recognition can be given out for him in this regard. And it's starting to appear in brochures and kiosk kind of stuff and things like that. And I'd like to say one further thing in wrapping up, and that's that a lot of my discussion today has been about Frank Pratt Jr. And really, Lena played a huge role. His second wife, Helen Tower, did also, but we know less about her. But she undoubtedly was right in there too. But then later came Lena after Helen died. And Lena just had a lot of the same sensibilities. She had the exposure, over time to the historic structures and all. So I know she was right there as a part of it and promoting this and supporting her husband. But Lena, in her own right, in her own directions, had quite a professional career, as well as almost like combination professional volunteer activities with women's groups, both in the state and nationally. So I just like to throw out the idea that maybe somebody can run with that and do some research on Lena and come up with a presentation at some point. She deserves it. Okay, so anyway, a lot of really neat forces came into play to help make Eby's Landing Reserve what it is today, and kind of updated things a little bit today, and the story will continue. Thank you. And we'll go to questions and answers now.
Great.
And discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lee. That was such a great, very concise overview of a lot of that. I appreciated that information. And before we went and had more people on here, he showed me a photo of Mr. Pratt and said, "Do you know who this is?" And I'd never seen a photo before. So even from the very start, I really appreciate that. Yeah. And I love, I'll take a look at it again for sure. I love how I agree with you. It really captured what he was all about with the books and everything like that, reading.
Helps bring it alive, I hope. And there is literally a treasure trove of photographs. Not so much of Frank, interestingly enough. There's others show up more. But also correspondence. Some really neat stuff shows up in the area of letters that are preserved today up at the Pratt House, and that you can access through these digitized files that I mentioned earlier.
Joanne has a question, Lee.
Okay, Patrick.
Hi.
Joanne has a question.
Hi.
Thank you.
You said you might touch on Robert Pratt, and could you, can you give him any credit for also being a preservationist?
Thank you. That was actually in my prepared remarks, but I skipped over it. Yeah, definitely Robert was important. He was. In kind of some different ways, but later in his life, he continued to continued the stewardship of the family. Robert himself, you may know, I'm sure you do, being local. Did you grow up here, Joanne? Did you grow up in Coopville?
No, I grew up my formative years were in Nebraska, but I've been out in Western Washington most of my life, and in Coopville for 33 years. So I'm a newbie.
Oh, okay. Yeah, right. So we're about the same number of years actually here. So you've heard probably a lot of things about Robert. Robert was kind of controversial. He had some maybe a developmental issue, and so he was both talented in some things and a little bit awkward in the social arena. Well, he ended up leaving the prairie as he became a young man and went to Seattle. And having done that, you just don't know quite how that could have turned out for up here in the properties that he ended up inheriting. He was a sole child to inherit the estate, and but he was gone. He was in Seattle, and at times he was a bit of a recluse when he was growing up. Later, he became very much one. Things were in doubt. How's this going to turn out? Well, as it happened, he really continued the program that Frank had set in motion, Frank and his wives. And so he made sure that the properties were passed into good hands. And the very most important ones were, there was actually an inheritor from New York City who we knew very little about, who fortunately was not one of the ones to get the significant properties. And so anyway, that part ended well too. So we're in pretty good shape today. And we have Robert Pratt to thank, in addition to Frank and Lena and Helen and the Eby family and so on. Yeah.
Claire Picard told me kind of a funny story about Robert. He said, Robert allowed her and Ken to live in the house. The
Jacob Eby cabin.
The Jacob Eby house, right. And so Claire said one summer day, she was out, Ken and Claire were out there clearing away the nettles that had grown up around the house. And Robert showed up and he said, stop. He didn't want those nettles taken down because they were an indigenous plant and used by the coastal Salish for all sorts of things. So it was kind of funny. But I was going to ask you, Lee, how did Frank Pratt originally get up here? To the Pacific Northwest? What brought him up here?
That's an interesting story. And I think we have time to get into things like this. This is kind of a side trip, but it's really important in the sense that it shows a little bit about Frank's background and the fact that he was an attorney to a certain extent. He graduated from Amherst College in Massachusetts as an attorney, and one of his classmates ended up being the Secretary of State of the United States during World War I. Yeah, something like I'm struggling over that gentleman's name. But anyway, the two of them left Greenfield, Massachusetts, and traveled west to Seattle. And then the fellow who's going to be Secretary of State continued north to Alaska because he has an assignment. He was to kind of negotiate a treaty up there that had to do with natural resources, and I think boundary lines were part of it. So anyway, this kind of shows some of Frank's background, that he actually was an attorney, as I understand it. We know very little about actually what he did as an attorney, but he seemed to be one related to international affairs. And I think the story is that he may have traveled to South America and other places as part of his work occasionally. But mostly Frank just traveled for pleasure. He went around the world supposedly several times. He got around. As an attorney on in Washington State, he had a practice set up in Seattle, which he did for several years. From there, he went to LeConner, still as an attorney, and we have some letterhead for these offices that he set up. Yeah, we do. And then finally, he and Helen Tower Pratt, his second wife, putted over here. They actually loaded their vehicle onto something like the Callista, one of the packet boats, and that got mentioned in the newspaper, and discovered the properties and everything from there. So that's how he got here.
Wow. Wow.
All right, I have a question as well. Okay, so which wife was Robert's mother? And do you know the relationship between Frank and Robert? Or how was their relationship?
Okay, relationship between Lena and Robert. Is that right?
Or, well, Frank and Robert. And then was Lena Robert's mother?
Robert. Okay. Yeah. You're going to make it a little more interesting. I don't know that Robert ever had any blow-ups and awkward things with his mom. I haven't seen it. With his dad, boy, we're getting into something really curious. Robert was very important to Frank, and family was very important to Frank. Family standing and so forth, proper upbringing was very important to Frank. Here we have a little bit of New England heritage showing through. If Robert did not conduct himself as a gentleman, it's said that he would find himself in the Longhouse. That's the longish building that I mentioned, just kind of right close to the main residence, that was fully outfitted for living and had all the books in it today even. At some point, Robert ended up living in the Longhouse. And I think he might have had a nanny too with him there, at least part of the time. And it actually shows up in some of the digital files that Frank said to Robert at one point, that until you conduct yourself as a gentleman, you'll be in the Longhouse. Apparently, Frank had a fairly low tolerance for some things like that, conduct and so on. So, but like I said, Robert was very important to Frank, and there's an awful lot of correspondence and gift-related notes that are the highest order for how important Robert was to Frank in his growing up days and all. But we did hear that later on, during his University of Washington time, and that would have been most of it before Frank died, that there were some difficulties, and I don't need to go into detail about those, but it was just very unfortunate. So, and then Robert, was growing up as a young man, and he had an interest in girls, and apparently he took kind of a wrong turn from the family's point of view about his first marriage. And so that didn't set well. Oh, the schooner Suva, you asked about, Joanne. Originally, that schooner was supposed to go to Robert, but then a codicil was placed in Frank's will. So this is a later development, an update on the will, and it didn't end up going to Robert, and instead went to Frank's banker, who was later to become the founder of Washington Mutual. That's the Schmidt family.
Not to ask all the questions here, but I should know this. Did Frank Pratt acquire the Jacob and Sarah Eby house from Elmira or from Elmira's children?
I believe, yeah, that's from Elmira.
From Elmira.
Yeah.
Okay.
A word about Elmira and the Jacob Eby cabin. while Elmira was in California, she did come up, as I understand, to the Jacob Eby cabin regularly during the summers. And I believe she ended up dying in the house. Yeah, one summer. Uh-huh. And, that does raise a question about when she died. I know she's in negotiation with Elmira, and I assume that's where it finally got resolved and the title passed. But it's possible that it could have been somebody else in the family from California.
Well, Sandy can, they can look when Elmira died, and we can figure out when the transfer of the property was made.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I believe it was the daughters, Elmira's daughters, who signed the papers.
Okay, yeah. That's starting to make sense. Thank you, Sandy.
I learned that somewhere. I can't tell you what the source was, but that's what I've always had in my head.
Yeah, it gets really fuzzy when it comes to Elmira's children. Mm-hmm. I just have not seen that much on it. But while we're on the subject of how Frank acquired some of his properties, I want to mention to you that for the main residence, that too is a little fuzzy, but we do have some clarity on it. That was a case where he was not dealing with Ebys. The property had passed from Eason Eby to, I think his first name is John Gould. John Gould was kind of a player in this area of Puget Sound. And John Gould owned what's today the Smith Farm and that sort of thing.
Right.
He himself, and there's a Gould house in town too. He himself, though, mostly had as his residence Crescent Harbor area. He acquired a donation land claim there. I believe he acquired it rather than had it initially. And so the property here on the prairie was his. But then John Gould died, and then there were two people in the family from far away who inherited. And if my memory is correct, I believe Frank dealt with them remotely to acquire 5 acres there in what originally was part of Isaac Eby's donation land claim rather than the Jacob Eby donation land claim. So Frank had parts of each donation land claim. Mm-hmm.
One of our docents is Paul Bishop.
Yes.
Paul tells a story about how, I guess, there was a pretty big fire out the house, right?
Yes, that's right.
And Paul tells a story about rushing out there, I think probably as a young teenager.
Mm-hmm. On his bicycle.
Bucket brigade or whatever.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, that's exactly right. This is a fun story to hear if you can get Paul to be talking about this kind of thing. It's just cool. What happened was he indeed rushed up to the house while it was burning. And some of Oak Harbor even rushed to the house, including the Navy, by the way, for the purpose of pulling things out of the house to save them, because about 2/3 of the total structure was totally burned. The remaining 1/3 was pretty badly singed in some areas. The result was a lot of the belongings inside were in great jeopardy. Well, with this bucket brigade, that Patrick described, they were actually able to save most of what was in the house. They did lose some. But Paul, getting back to him, in Lena's memory, specialized in pulling the books out. Okay. Quite a nice collection of books.
Yeah.
Okay. So then later, as Paul grows up, he stays in touch with Lena. Lena has a place in her heart for Paul because he saved the books.
Oh my God.
Okay.
Yeah.
So at that point, Paul got reading rights. He could come up to the house, to the library, and read the books in the library after things were put back together. It took a couple of years to put the house back together and outfit it. Yeah, and the art was included in that. Some of it got singed, but I think most of it was saved. We don't know exactly which ones were lost, but today there's a lot of oil paintings and watercolors in the house by pretty prominent artists, both locally on Puget Sound and in Massachusetts.
Do you know if
you can get as much out of Paul as you can?
So Rich has a question.
Okay, Rich.
yeah, the property that now is called Pratt Woods, was that owned by the Pratt family at one time? It's all in a lot of it's covered by a conservation easement. I know that. I looked at a property there to buy at one time, and it's pretty protected. But did the Pratt family own that, going out on a bluff kind of north of Eby's Landing?
Okay, which property
He
is it?
said he referred to it as the Pratt Woods.
Yeah, if you look at some of the maps, that's what they call it. It's a Pratt Conservatory or Pratt Woods.
Okay, you're specifically asking about the forest area right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting because it ties into one document that we have digitized. In this document, written by Raleigh Sherman, who was doing some work for Frank Pratt. So this is while Frank was still alive. Raleigh does this one-page description, it might be 2 pages, typed out, nicely written, of an experience with Frank and Lena. And what that was in Raleigh's car, which was converted into kind of a truck. Raleigh essentially picked up Frank and Lena at their house, and Lena was sitting on a box in the back of this converted car, which had become a truck, to ride out to this area that you're talking about. And Raleigh describes that forest as being a lot of new growth. Apparently it had been logged quite a bit, and there was some alder growing up and all first. And one of the things Frank tried to do was to create some roads through that so that he could drive to the bluff and have a view out from it. This was something that Frank wanted. And I think maybe Raleigh was helping him with it. So they rode out there, and it was, as you can imagine, kind of a rough road. So here's Lena sitting on a box in the back of the vehicle, and they hit a low area of the crude road that they were traveling on. And Frank says, "Give her hell, Raleigh." And he wanted him to speed up and go down that hill, and, kind of like a roller coaster or something. And that goes to show that Frank actually had he could be spirited. He could be more than this kind of serious looking evaluator of things. He could really get into stuff like sailing, and he actually did really amazing automobile trips too, which is another story up in British Columbia that he did with several other families. So anyway, thanks for asking about the woods. And I heard there was kind of a steam-powered harvesting machine that was in that woods at one time. And of course, the sheep barn is one of the 2 sheep barns is located right on the fringe of it, and so forth. Yeah.
I live next to the Pratt property where the Pratt house is, and just below the house that Roberta Smith had built. And I heard a story from a neighbor about, that big snag that fell over that's out in the middle of the farm field up there by the Jacob Eby house. Evidently, Robert, we heard the story about the nettles, but even when he lived in Seattle, I heard the story that he used to call Roberta's husband about once every 3 months to ask if that snag was still standing, because when he gave permission to farm there, he did not give permission to cut that snag down.
Oh my gosh, another instance like the nettles where he gets fixated on these things. Well, that just ties right in with what we know about Robert and his studies. he was very detail oriented. When he got into something, usually in nature, it could be geology, it could be botany, it could be insects. The natural world was very much of interest to Robert. So when he got into it, he really got into it. And so, I mean, he even did a major paper on a spider that you find on the bluff above Evie's Landing. I mean, just totally on this one subject. Yeah. And anyway, I could go on and on about how Robert is that way.
Yeah.
So I think these examples that we're hearing about the fixation on the well-being of the nettles and of the snag and these kinds of things, it speaks to how his brain worked, if you will. And anyway, he could focus enough that he got through the University of Washington with a degree, and I believe he got honors also with it.
Rich, did that, I was up there last week and first noticed that tree on the ground. Did that come down in the big windstorm that we had? The big
Yes, I walk up there every morning with my dog, and it fell down on the night of January 1st. It was gone the morning of January 2nd. It was lying on the ground.
Huh.
I didn't go over to look at it, but one of the neighbors did, and they said it's all rotten completely through.
Yeah.
You know, there's no real substance to it left.
Yeah, I walked out to it. That's true. It's all the inside is all. It's very rotten.
Hmm.
But it's still a magnificent thing just lying there.
Yeah, my wife Lindy and I have been aware of that, and we asked, why was that tree left there to begin with? I mean, it was there for a long time, maybe just by itself. I don't know. Anybody know any lore about another structure?
Yeah, that's a story. When, according to a neighbor, Gordon Sears, that when Robert gave permission to farm up there, he said that tree could not be, or that snag could not be removed.
Oh, wow.
And he used to call to check on it every 3 months.
Good to know.
To see that it was still standing.
Oh my gosh. Well, that just speaks to so many things about the Pratt lore. There, in the family, there was an incredible loyalty to people who preserved things and cared for things that they cared about. And, the most average of a person, potentially, if they were of the right interests in things, potentially could wind up with an inheritance that they would show gratitude. For example, the Oriental rug supplier for Frank in New York City had some kind of relationship with him where Frank said, come on out and we'll go sailing in Suva. And then, if I'm not mistaken, I think somebody in that family was one of Robert's inheritors of some parcels of land.
Yeah, she was. I have a copy of Robert's will, which is probated in King County Superior Court, and he specifically designates. Turns out, I think Ron told me this, Hanson, that she was the daughter of the Oriental rug dealer.
Okay, that sounds right.
And she was in New York, and the story goes that they brought her out to the reserve, and the manager of the reserve at the time was Robert. I can't remember the guy's name.
Oh yeah, Robert. Rob Harbor.
Yes, Rob. So they gave the woman from New York a tour of the property that she now had inherited, and that's what led to negotiations with her that she granted the option, and that's where the Nature Conservancy and others, raised a tremendous amount of money to buy the property from her.
Oh,
They had to buy it from her. And I think Ron told me they had to raise $9 million to buy it from
whoa. I'm glad you know the rest of that story.
her. So that's always been curious to me why Robert put that in his will. But getting back to the tree for a second, that tree has been fascinating to me. I don't know if that Sunnyside farm, if Jacob and Sarah had to, maybe you know this, Rich, whether they had to clear that of woods to grow, or whether it was a glacial prairie. I mean, if they had to clear it for the build a house and conduct the farm,
Mm-hmm.
Presumably they were the ones that left the tree there.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
I don't know if they did. I don't know if it was a glacial prairie. I tend to doubt it.
I kind of doubt it too. It's up high.
I kind of doubt it.
Yeah. Yeah. And
I don't know for sure, but I kind of doubt it too, that it was a prairie. I think they probably had to clear timber from it.
Right. And I have seen a record, I think you give it to me, of it was like some county related like records of the different holdings around the prairie in terms of how much of the acreage was improved and how much was unimproved. And I think I recall for that particular property, the Jacob Eby one, that there was a relatively small number there for the amount of improved land compared to the rest.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things I've wondered is why the Jacob, Evie, and Sarah built the house precisely on the location it is. When you walk around there when it's windy, that is the most windy spot, short of going out on a bluff.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Not sure, but it's right next to their son's claim.
Although the view is
for one thing,
tremendous.
Yeah, and everything's downhill from there. Yeah.
I've also,
water, excuse me.
No, I was just going to say that I've seen photos where there were more trees and things around the house, so I feel like that probably provided some wind blockage. It wasn't quite as clear as it is today.
Probably, yeah.
Well, the other thing I ran across reading, can't remember where, but they used to call that Beaux-Art Hill, where the Jacob and Sarah Eby house is.
Oh,
Beaux-Art House or something like that. Because Mary Beaux-Art, the eldest, I think, is this right? The eldest daughter of Jacob and Sarah.
Right.
Yeah. So she would also come up from California for the summer, hang out in the house. She loved doing it. She writes in her journals how enjoyable it was. Ellison and Easton would watch over her. She'd come up there and hang out there. And there's entries in her journals about how pleasant it was walking through the orchards, plural, around the house. And so, as some of you may know, I've fixated on that pear tree. So there must have been more fruit trees.
Mm-hmm. And I think right alongside
the house.
Yeah, right alongside the blockhouse too.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, I think some kind of an apple tree or two used to be, in my memory, right up next to the blockhouse. And then as part of the latest maintenance care for the blockhouse, they took them down. Yeah, but that could have been a remnant from an orchard or two there. Yeah.
The lilac bushes that are in and around the the infamous dog water faucet. Ken and Claire planted those lilac bushes. But the pear tree has been there for a long, long time.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Any other questions we have today? Let's see. Yeah, I keep hoping, as somebody who's focused on the Pratt family, I keep hoping for more information to emerge. I've read most of the digitized files. done a little bit of newspaper research, both here and in other cities and places related. Talked to some people around here, but not all that I need to get to about the Pratt family. There's definitely some good knowledge alive around here still today. Then there's a bit of a treasure trove at the University of Washington Library that I mentioned, which I think could reveal some more things, but I do have a feeling for it now as a result of this friend having recently visited there and taken some photos of the materials and all. It really helped a lot. But in my online searches, I haven't been able to come up with some things that I'd hoped to. So anyway, I hope we'll all keep at it and add to it, because I think this is a real worthwhile area to flesh out and have available for posterity in connection with the reserve.
Thank you, Lee.
Yes.
Good.
Thank you.
Lee, thank you so
Susan.
much for sharing all of your knowledge today, or probably not all of it, but a good portion of your knowledge on the Pratt family. And I know several people weren't able to make it, but this will be watched several times on our YouTube channel. I love to go through and review the presentations right before the house opens in the summer. So I'm sure this will definitely be utilized for many more seasons to come. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. And I would love to see you out at the house this summer, sharing your knowledge with visitors as well.
Thank you. I'd love to. I want to give a thanks to Patrick for being here. He was a big help, and he was another ear for me too, which I need. Thank you. And it's been great talking about all this with you. Okay, take care.
Absolutely. All right. Take care,
Thanks, Lee.
everyone. Thank you for joining us today.
Bye.
Bye-bye.